Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is titled, Can Automation Deliver Truly Scalable Manufacturing in CGT? By way of an introduction, my name is Abby. I am the Senior Marketing Manager for Facilitate. We organise and run Advanced Therapies Week, which took place a little earlier in the year. And we're so excited to be able to recreate this particularly well-attended session from the event itself in a virtual format so that we can kind of open up the conversation to a much broader audience. We're joined today by a highly experienced panel who will explore this critical question. So chairing today's session, we have Edwin Stone, CEO of Cellular Origins. He'll be joined by Meg Wood and John Knighton, who will introduce themselves shortly. Together, they bring deep expertise across investment, development, and large-scale manufacturing, and we're looking forward to a thought-provoking discussion. Before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. We'll have time at the end of the session to answer a selection of your questions, so please do feel free to submit this via the Q&A function. You'll also find additional information in the handout section. Feel free to explore those resources at any time. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Edwin to get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Abby. Welcome, everybody. We had a really enjoyable session back in San Diego and delighted to be able to take the time to dig a little bit deeper into this topic today. What we tried to frame it as in the last discussion was automation has for a long time been recognized as a key tool in driving forwards patient access in cell and gene therapy. I think the conversation has often struggled to perhaps get under the skin as deeply as it could. And what we want to try and do today is tackle this in three different sections. Firstly, thinking about the technology and what a technology really needs to do to deliver on customer needs. Secondly, thinking about this from an operational perspective, and that's both an operational perspective of the people providing the technologies, but also an operational perspective of the users of the technologies. And finally, we've been speaking about automation for so long now that there is a question of what the roadmap even needs to be to drive adoption. How do we get from where we are today to a position where automation is actually enabling the promise of these therapies? So without further ado, I want to hand over to Meg and John just to introduce themselves and also to tell them a little bit about their journey, their experience of automation, their experience of robotics. John, could you kick us off, please?
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you again and on the panel, so thanks for the invite. Yeah, my name's John Knighton. I head up the cell therapy development here at Johnson & Johnson, and have been working closely in the cell and gene therapy space now for over 10 years. So the automation itself, I think it's driving needs across autologous cell therapy. As we know that it is a 1-to-1 patient to batch ratio, and in of itself drives the scalability of the technology is absolutely required. And I've been thinking about this and working on the automation front and how we can improve our manufacturing and provide this therapy across the larger populations for a number of years, and have been working closely with Cellular Origins on how we might be able to develop this technology to provide this medicine that's going to provide treatment to our patients.
Thanks, John. Meg.
Yes, pleasure to be here with you again today. My name is Meg Wood. I'm the Managing Director of NYBC Ventures. We're a single LP venture firm. Our LP is New York Blood Center. We invest in both therapeutics and devices, and so we see the pain points of cell therapy in particular in two ways. One, creating the therapeutics themselves, but then also the scalability that John was referencing. So we've chosen to deploy capital into the therapeutic space because of the remarkable efficacy of these products, and we've also decided to put money in investments into automation and robotics. And specifically, we are investors in Cellular Origins, which we're very proud of. And we also have experience with automation / robotics through another investment that we've made. But we do feel it's very important to think about scalability in cell therapy and to sort of resolve what we'll call the engineering challenges, or how we perceive them to be engineering challenges around that manufacturing capability and capacity. And so we continue to deploy and think about the space broadly, and are enthusiastic about where automation can play a role. And in our opinion, again, I think it is a very critical component of achieving that scale.
Thanks, Meg. And yeah, I think that's a great place to start us off. That engineering challenge here. I think my first experience of cell therapy was back in 2014, and as an engineer by background, it really stood out to me, this incredible biology. I think we all know for a long time we've had therapies that deliver efficacy that we never normally get to see in therapies, particularly given the targets we're going after here, almost by definition targets where previous modalities have struggled. But there is this gap in the engineering piece, and I think I'd make an observation that for a long time the engineering and the biology kind of proceeded side by side, and I think perhaps the future we need the engineering and the biology to come close together. And so interested in your thoughts, John, having kind of, as you point out, a lot of experience within this field, as well as having seen kind of the run into this field, and as cell and gene therapy it's kind of been born as a new industry. What do you really think you need to see as someone that is really looking to get the benefits of automation, is looking to wrestle with the practicalities of what you need day to day? What do you need to see in a solution to be able to deliver on your needs?
Yeah, no, great question, Edwin. So, I mean, the first and foremost, right, I totally agree that the autologous cell therapy space is seeing unprecedented efficacy, and that drives, I think, everything that we want to do here, and the excitement around it, as it also we're starting to see data coming in on other therapeutic areas beyond even oncology, as we're looking at immunology, and that even opens up the field even broader in terms of the need for a solution. And the way that we're doing it today is meeting the needs, but when we move to tens of thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of patients per year across the industry, what we're doing today will not scale, and nor is it efficient. So the automation needs, one, it comes into robustness in the end, right? We need to make sure when we promise a patient who's this is their last treatment, that we're going to be able to turn something around and get it back to them. So it's both on the process side, but also on the automation. We need to make sure it's robust, that it's reproducible, and that it's efficient in its work that it's proceeding to do to help save that patient's life in some cases.
And I think that's really interesting when we talk about robustness and reproducibility, and that often I think that that's not necessarily so much part of the dialogue. For a long time we've been talking about automation as a means to reduce cost, automation as a means to increase scale, and of course that's kind of the key benefits we've been striving for. I don't think necessarily we spend as much time as an industry talking about the reproducibility and the reliability of these systems, and I think it's interesting you talk about that. I think certainly we see that there are concerns actually about that. For all the strengths and weaknesses of sort of a manual process, I think there are definitely worries of the end user of at least people know a human manufactured therapy can make it to patients. That's what the field's grown on. Maybe it's limited in terms of how many patients it can get to because of the cost and because of the scalability, but of course it's quite rightly there's a lot of focus on the risk of, are we confident automation can produce batches reliably, repeatably? I mean, you'd like to think that actually that is a benefit of automation. I'm just interested, John, if do you think that has been a concern in the industry in terms of the adoption of have the solutions been able to demonstrate enough confidence around the robustness and reliability that you might start to see that as a benefit rather than a potential risk?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's amazing that the rapid adoption of automation and robots across different industries, right? It's unprecedented, right? You hear about Musk and some of the other players in the auto industry. I do think the technology is advancing. I do think that the robustness and the reliability of the solutions on the technology have greatly improved and continue to do so, where it does start to come into a place where it can replace a more manual process with people and allow that reproducibility, the robustness. It takes away some of the concerns with sterility as well, and also the stress on the operators in and of itself. It's an easy manufacturing process for our operators and our technicians working on this to realize that they cannot make a mistake because they may not be able to get the apheresis to repeat or have the time for that patient to get that apheresis to repeat that need. Again, it goes back to getting this product back to the patients because they really are waiting for this product. And the robustness and the reliability coming in with the automation and robotics and as you tie in the AI eventually and the learnings, this becomes a very powerful tool for us to scale this technology.
Really interesting. And Meg, I'm sure with an investor hat on, again, it's table stakes, I'd imagine, before you look at an investment. Is this delivering on a need of the customer? But the word of the last few months, certainly from JPM and beyond, seems to be around execution and can companies deliver on the promise of the innovations that they're bringing to market? And I could imagine that as an investor, you want to get confident that it's not just a great idea, but it is actually a product that's going to be out there. It's going to be delivering robust, reliable operation, and whether that's within cell and gene or within your other investments. I'm interested in kind of how you think about some of the technology risks when you're making these investments and how you build that confidence and what you want to see to build that confidence in these solutions that they can deliver on that robust, reliable, whether it's a Vitestro or whether it's in cell therapy.
Yeah. Well, I said it on stage, so I'm just going to re-quote myself back at the facility. But engineers matter, and this is a happy realization for myself, and especially when it comes to products like what Cellular Origins is building, and then also in the case of Vitestro, is this pairing of engineering mentality to a biological product, right? Which is really important. So from baseline, that's my assumption, is that there's qualified individuals who are able to build a device, a machine, a sort of three-dimensional existing object. So that's problem set number one. But problem set number two, which is I think equally as important and something that we look for, is the ability to commercialize, right? Because commercialization is a much different challenge in this type of setting, in the automation setting, than it is in a pharmaceutical setting. And that challenge is not to be shortchanged. It's almost as I use the comparable when I'm evaluating an earlier stage biotech pharmaceutical product. CMC matters, right? So you have to think about CMC, but rarely does commercialization matter at that stage. Here, you have to bring this forward almost immediately and really think about what your commercialization strategy is going to be. And is it a qualified commercial strategy, or is it built on hope and alone, right? And so has it been vetted and validated as being meeting the market where it is today, and will it actually be deployable on the day that it needs to be? It's a revenue consideration versus therapeutic consideration. But I do want to also sort of kick back to what John was discussing. These are precious products, different to robots in the Amazon warehouse, which are moving, boxes of toilet paper from one place to another. This is, a much different, there's a much different level of necessity around this and in preciseness. And I do think that that's another key element when thinking and evaluating technologies in the cell and gene space. These are not just biological products, but these are incredibly precious biological products. And I think also, to reference the point that, yes, there's bigger indications coming online, but there's also the hope and promise. And I really do, have my fingers crossed for the patient community that these therapies are moving from, last line therapy to something closer to first line because of their efficacy. Yes, they are, challenged with some additional impacts on the patient, but, I do think we've all heard stories and probably heard it at the last meeting we were together, that, there are patients out there who are not even being offered the CAR T product, right? And do not even know the product exists. And I think that as we sort of move through those channels as well, that is an additional pain point for the manufacturing process. It's the current therapeutic paradigm as well as the emerging paradigms.
Yeah, thanks, mate. I think Amazon comes up a lot as an exemplar. Actually, one day I must get round to getting the numbers from them of what their error rate on things like picks and deliveries are, because I think actually it would pass probably some pretty stringent quality assessments. And I think the reason I'd observe they can do that, and they have to do that, is every mistake they make potentially is killing their margin. Their margin is so thin on everything they deliver. They have to be really robust and reliable. And so our field obviously does hold itself to a different bar, but I think it's quite interesting to look at. We hold ourselves to that bar quite often from a regulatory point of view, not necessarily from a commercial imperative point of view, whereas the Amazons and the likes of this world have this massive commercial imperative to make sure their systems are robust and reliable. And I think it's interesting that when I think if I was being harsh to the kind of current state of cell therapy automation, we're behind the likes of Amazon. They have adopted and moved quicker. And I think the positive there is a lot of the hard work has been done. Things like mobile robots, efficient path planning, efficient productivity. They've had to develop that because without it, they haven't got a business, or at least they've got a much less successful business. That's the thing that's driving their ability to get product to people the next day, or sometimes even same day. And there's us as an industry kind of getting a bit hung up on our logistics flow. Well, I think we can sometimes take a bit of inspiration, but I think when that commercial driver is there, which is perhaps a good segue into thinking a bit more about what we need from an operational and a company side. And I'm really interested in, John, particularly when thinking about flexibility. I think one of the things that quite reasonably, I think, is sometimes levered at automation. I think we saw this with lab automation is why do people still keep doing pipetting manually for certain steps in labs? And it's because there is a flexibility. If you don't need to reprogram it, I think a human can kind of very quickly swap between different protocols. And then as you move on to a liquid handling robot, you're starting to lock down protocols, but you get a benefit of productivity. I'm interested in how you think about that at J&J, and whether you do see a trade-off with flexibility, and if not, how you look to manage that.
No, it is an important piece. And when we're looking at technologies, as we're building our platform, the cell therapy space and autologous in particular, but across the board, the technology doesn't sit idle, right? We do know that, will there be better tools to use, and the ability to adapt our platform, whether it's an individual unit or the entire process of manufacturing, requires flexibility. And I think the ability to pop in new technologies as they develop, or in process analytical tools into the manufacturing process that are being developed is very critical. So when we're looking to develop a process and pick a platform, we're looking for technologies that can scale, but also that can evolve as the technology evolves and adapt accordingly, because we know that the field is adapting. We're getting better tools. We're getting better PAT tools to monitor cells, and that will be part of our future. So to pick a technology, you have to think ahead to how will it fit? How can we also adapt not just the hardware, but also the software, and then tie that into eventually even more into AI learning and have that continuing learning process. So it's both hardware and software, and how is that adaptability built in, while we're still being able to achieve compliance in the end also as well from a quality standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's something we've thought very long and hard about at Cellular Origins. Is I think there's a real danger from a customer point of view, but also from a business point of view from us, that if you end up just selecting a limited number of technologies without that flexibility to adapt, we can assume that this industry is mature would be, I think, wrong to do so. I think there's still a lot of change to come. I hope there's a lot of change to come. You mentioned AI. I think we can speculate on how big that impact will be, but what we absolutely must do as Cellular Origins as a company, but also believe as an industry, is lay the foundation so that what we don't do is end up with a solution that is great as we sit here in 2026, but it'll look exactly the same in 2036, because then we'll have failed to get all the benefit again of all those kind of incredible developments that are happening elsewhere in automation. Interesting your thoughts on this, Meg, again, with sort of the world you're in. You, I should imagine, are always cognizant that things change. It'd be nice if we're in a deterministic world. Your life would be very easy, right? If you could say, I guess your job almost is to predict the future, right? And not just which companies will succeed, but which industries you need to be in and which solutions will best match those needs. How do you think about that when you're looking at the field? How do you balance that that need to have, as you said, a company that you're confident you've got engineers building something that's meaningful, but at the same time against a backdrop that things will move?
Well, I think there's a stickiness factor in cell manufacturing, cell and gene. I don't know as much about gene, so I'm just going to say cell. So I think, there's processes that have been adopted that are very hard to undo right now. And so I think you can't, and you said it best, Edwin, so I'm quoting you now, but you can't quantum leap in this space. And I think it is just generally hard to quantum leap in manufacturing because of the CapEx spend required to build up facilities, and then the expectation around consistency and manageability. But I do think if there's new platforms available, and, of course, I'm biased towards Cellular Origins, the way I was looking at it is this is setting a new platform, right? It's not necessarily requiring too much change within the processes themselves, but it's a new platform that's being applied as a wrapper around the manufacturing, which then can enable the future state, right? So it's sort of building out that nice foundation to enable AI applications or connectivity on either side, and really adaptable to the needs of the client, which I think is what is necessary to create that slow walk towards quantum leap.
I think it's interesting that for so long, biologically, we've often thought biotechs often emerge with that label of platform and being a platform, but we often don't see that, and we see that, I think, more in software, but less with kind of physical hardware tools. I think you're quite often into a pigeonhole, and I think that's been necessary. I think if you're building the world's greatest bioreactor, the world's greatest cell editor, and we need people to do that. I mean, that's something that's going to enable the next generation of therapies. And to your point, John, is we need an industry, hopefully, that can take those tools to scale. But I think that platform piece, I think, has often been missed. That need to kind of, we've got these great kind of islands of technology, but how do we link those together physically and digitally? And perhaps that's a good segue just to think about that digital piece, which I think is often a bit hidden under the surface. People, I know with Cellular Origins, people kind of see what we're doing robotically, and that's the thing people focus on because it is very, very visual, which we're very, very lucky. But when we're thinking about automation, I think it's often used as a bit of a catch-all term, and so sometimes it's used to describe a unit operation that can operate hands-off, because it wasn't too long ago before actually a unit operations in this field required a lot of tending. Now we've got things that a user can step away from an hour for 5 hours, and it can culture the cells, it can separate the cells, whatever that step's doing. But I think if we focus this on actually end-to-end automation, how do we link these steps together? There's that physical piece, but perhaps just moving to that digital piece, John. In terms of that data flow, I'm interested in your thoughts on both what that gives you now from the point of view of getting away from USB sticks, paper entry, but also perhaps potentially where that might take you in the future. You mentioned AI, and I'm assuming, but interested to hear from you, how you kind of see that data unlocking things as we move forwards.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty, I guess, in some ways of autologous cell therapy is that each patient is one single batch, and you can have thousands of batches done, tens of thousands of batches potentially done per year. That's a treasure trove of data from a manufacturing view, right? For us to look at from a process view. That ability then to pull that data up from the individual units of the manufacturing process to see how that's influencing eventually into the patient outcomes, drives new thinking. It drives ways for us to continually improve our process or tighten parameters or even broaden parameters as well. So the opportunity in the fact that we're running so many batches is that it does provide a great opportunity to continually improve our robustness, and look, see where areas might where we didn't even look before, and that's an area that you don't get that opportunity with other modalities, such where you're not running as many batches and have that tie back to a single patient and some clinical outcomes. So not only is it on the manufacturing side to say, all right, did I pass my spec in the end, or did it meet the parameters? But at the end, we can also look at the patient outcomes, and then that ties back in as we continue to understand the biology of cell therapy, what's critical and what isn't, and allow us to either tighten or broaden specs and look to the future, say, look, we need to continue to improve our platform and have those discussions with vendors like Cellular and say, all right, how can we improve to take this even further to provide products to our patients?
I love that, John. I tell you why is that 9 times out of 10, when people talk about autologous cell therapies being one batch, one patient, we see it as a negative. The idea that actually there's a positive in that from a data point of view, there's actually an opportunity to get data to feed that back into the process. I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that'd be wonderful. I think it puts the onus on us to collect that data, which I think I'm not so sure we've necessarily got with manual processes the ability to do. I think it's another reason why I think automation, people often forget that piece. We talk about automation. Yes, it reduces cost. Yes, it increases quality, but that ability to access much richer, much more reliable data and feeding that back, I think is really valuable. Meg, I'll ask you the tricky question on this one then. Is moving forwards, is this about the hardware, about the data? Where do you see the value?
Well, that is a tricky question. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way, because I always see them as paired, right? To extract the right amount of data or the right data, consistent data, the assumption is there's hardware in place. I think where we would move in a larger patient population being served by these types of products, right, would be maybe shared data, consistently shared data, which is what a platform like this like Cellular Origins could enable, not shared competitively, pre-competitively data, where we start to recognize the product itself instead of the process itself, right? What can we understand about the product, less about the process? And I think that that's sort of what's missing. And I know that there's always a healthy debate, like the process is the product currently. And I've had discussions with people that they really want to flip that. But I think to be able to do that, it needs characterization in a way that probably doesn't exist today, right? And standardization. And I think the best way to achieve that would be through, we'll call it an anonymized large data set existing, probably because of advancement in hardware. And I don't think that that's extractable today. And when John was speaking, I was thinking, I wonder if I've ever seen a report as to where there is digital data sets existing today from the processes that everyone is currently using. So everyone obviously has a variation, but they all follow a similar pathway, cell separation, activation, and so on. Are there rich data sets that exist today? And I don't think there are, right? And I do think that would come from a sort of more platform-based solution. So hardware first, data second.
I think there's Stephen Ward from Cell Therapy Catapult, someone we're fortunate to work with, has for a long time been highlighting the value that could be gained from confederated data. I think it's tricky. I mean, I think particularly, again, I've wrestled with the idea, why do we not see this? I've sat in the audience where panels, particularly panels of CDMOs, are ones that I remember in particular, also saying, wouldn't it be great if we share data? Most processes, the product, they acknowledge most of what they're doing is the same. and yet they're all keeping it close and not sharing it.
Yeah.
But I think it's a bit of the state of the industry that until people know where the competitive landscape is, it's hard for people to get comfortable sharing that.
But it also might be that the data set isn't clean, right? I mean, it's sort of like a homebrewed data set. And I'm not saying that to diminish the value of the data set, but I think that it's been easier to share CRM related data because of evolution of CRM data sets themselves, right? And I think if there was an ease in sharing, maybe that would help, be an advantage.
So actually the structure of the data, I'm interested in your thoughts, John. Where do you think the state of the art is in terms of how well structured, how well labeled, how common even between sites, maybe within one company, those data sets are?
It's the golden goose, right? So I don't think we're mature at this stage on how we're labeling our data from discovery all the way through to manufacturing, right? And we're getting better. I think we're recognizing now that it's absolutely critical, and it seems like a simple thing to have a lexicon and say use this, right? But as we're moving from more manual thought processes and disconnected data in lab notebooks, right, moving into electronic notebooks and beyond, even from a process development standpoint, this now creates the ability for us to have common terms and data to be pulled and then aggregated. Now, there are tools, AIs helping also then to scrub where it may not be as critical, but it still needs information into how did you label your data? So the first piece is, you have to have a common lexicon, even within a single process. You may have multiple hands looking at data and then labeling it and understanding how it all fits. So it's an area that I think we're getting better at. I think it's being recognized and everybody's working towards it in different ways. And that will then allow, even within a single process and then into a platform within a company, to look at data and see what the commonalities are and how we can start combining it and look at solving solutions that weren't even thought of. So I do think everyone's on a different journey there, and it's an area that's going to continue to evolve. From there, the data sharing, and there are forums where industry and agencies and universities get together and talk about technologies and how to share and what provides value. And then if you can find a commonality, that looking at it in a way that can propel the industry and our treatments for our patients, having that some common understanding what the data stands for will allow us to take us to the next level.
See, you touched several times there on maturity, on the journey. So I want to move on to the third of our three topics and talk about roadmaps and where we are and where we need to get to. J&J's had an incredible few months in cell therapy, John. I mean, you passed 10,000 doses of Carvykti delivered to patients. I think that was in January, just a few weeks ago. The announcement of $1 billion of investment in manufacturing by J&J. Really, really exciting times, and shows the commitment J&J has to this field. Interested in your thoughts of what the key stepping stones are in this journey. As Meg highlighted a moment ago, I'm not a believer we can make these steps in one go and make a big leap. I don't think it's that sort of field. And so interested in your view of what are the steps we need to make, and how do we de-risk things along the way?
I know it's a great question, and thank you for recognizing J&J is very proud of, and along with our partner also on Legend with Carvykti and the 10,000 patients. J&J also made an announcement a few weeks ago of building a new manufacturing plant in Pennsylvania, which we're also very proud of for our upcoming platforms. It is a journey, as you're mentioning. Part of it is continued seeing efficacy and excitement on the treatments themselves. That's something that in some cases we have to see what the clinical outcomes are, but that continues to look good, as not just within J&J, but across the board. We're continuing to see that autologous cell therapy works. there's a lot of excitement about other modalities and that they're looking good as well. And J&J works on those as also. But right now, we also know that the unprecedented efficacy that we're getting out of autologous has not been matched. And it behooves us to continue to improve the platforms and bring this unprecedented technology to our patients. And the journey is now for us as an industry as a whole, and there's a number working on this, is how can we make this more affordable? How can we make it scalable and deliver to our patients in a way that provides value, gets that information out, as Meg was saying, that there's some areas where people aren't even familiar with CAR Ts, and they aren't given that opportunity to have that treatment to save their lives and provide something that is unknown, right? So we need to get that word out. We need to be able to deliver and then bring that treatment to patients.
Thanks, John. And I think that's the end point of getting these treatments to patients. I mean, Meg, really interested in your view. I guess you sort of see the ecosystem from quite a wide angle, given obviously NYBC and then down to the investments in companies like Cellular Origins. Interested in your thoughts of how you see the next 5 years playing out, and what things you think companies need to be ticking off if we're going to see this industry mature.
Well, yeah, and I want to be honest that there is a funding challenge for early stage therapeutics and cell therapy, right? J&J represents the sort of pinnacle, and there is a lot of headwinds ahead of us in the cell therapy space, and I think that is overcomable, right? If the business model starts to prove out, and I put this pressure on John on the last panel, but J&J showing some small profitability within their CAR products, I think is sort of game changing, and not just J&J, but anyone who's on the commercial side. I think that's always been the question, and it's a very easy way for investors to dismiss a category, right? Is that there is limitation in the profitability of a product, therefore, pharmaceutical companies aren't interested. It's a very easy dismissal point. If that is changed, and I do think that this group here is part of that change, if that changes by way of automation at all, I think we're looking at a whole new landscape for these very critical types of products. And I think, again, to achieve both moving from last line therapy to something higher order, plus, the addition of larger scale conditions, that this has to change, right? There has to be a change within the manufacturing capabilities. And so I do think that there will be a recognition of that, and with an eye towards profitability, automation will become critical. And so I do think that is, without a doubt, the future of cell therapy.
Thanks, Meg. And that's a nice segue into some of the questions that are in the chat. So start off with one for you, Meg. You mentioned the headwinds in the investment environment. So one of the questions around VC's investment in automation, and given the current funding situation, are VCs going to invest in automated manufacturing, or are they going to focus their attentions elsewhere, given the fact that there is limited capital to go around?
I wish I did, but I do not represent every VC. I will represent my own perspective. We made an investment in an automation play. I think if I were just to generalize, some of the opportunities are not necessarily the right fit for venture capital. There has to be other modalities of funding. I see PE as being a very interesting opportunity, but you have to get to a certain amount of revenue to be able to achieve. That's why I really appreciate the way Cellular Origins emerged, which was, from an incredible shop of its own, THP, and then was brought out as Cellular Origins. I think that is not what everyone can achieve, obviously, but I do think it's a methodology by which technology can be nurtured before it emerges. And I think that's very critical in sort of engineering based technologies, is that there is some baseline created before capital need. Investors have turned away from tools and devices. that is a fact. So again, I think it's a lagging indicator on where the biotech industry is currently. And, with some successes in the biotech / pharmaceutical space, I think that the tools, devices will pick back up again out of necessity. But it is not easy here in 2026 for emerging technologies in the space.
Thanks, Meg. And the next one talks about, we spoke about roadmaps, talks about specifically timelines to scale and 10,000 doses a year, and how long do we think it will be until we can reach that level of scale. I'll take this one to perhaps give other people a bit of time to think, given the fact it's a little bit of a pointy question. I think it does come down to roadmaps, and 10,000 doses a year is never going to be achieved by one group, one company alone. This requires several pieces to come together, and I think John highlighting earlier that actually that there are multiple pieces to this puzzle. That the thing as Cellular Origins we recognize is we can create the world's best manufacturing platform, but we still need enough consumables to feed this platform, enough single-use bioreactors, enough single-use bags. We need the supply chain set up for those, which as we sit here in 2026 are probably just about there, but we need to get those robust and reliable with second sources in place. And then of course there's the therapeutic piece, and so it's got to rely on having the clinicians ready to prescribe these, and particularly in an autologous setting that's double-ended. It's both at the taking the dose and delivering it. That said, I feel that we're now in the orders of a few years away rather than 5 or 10 years away from being able to hit those sort of points. And I think the success that J&J and Legend have had evidences that rate of growth has been quite dramatic. And I think with automation, we'll be able to flip that even more, because one of the great things I think moving forwards is we can get this so it's an economies of scale business. At the moment, we've never really had that as an industry. It becomes harder and harder with manual processes every time you want to get an extra dose per year out. But with the industry moving in the direction of automation, I think we'll move that so that actually more doses make it easier to increase scale. But interested, Meg and John, if you want to comment on when you think we'll start to hit, rather than 10,000 doses cumulative, we'll start seeing 10,000 and maybe even 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 doses per therapy, and perhaps what you think might be the things that we need to see to get us there. John, Meg?
Yeah, maybe I could start. I agree. I mean, it's not just one supplier or one technology, to your point, Edwin, right? There's an ecosystem that supplies the technology, the single-use technologies that go in. So it's not just the supply chain. And I do think the automation piece allows us to scale in a way that hasn't been able to work very effectively in the past. It takes 3 to 6 months or more to train a technician in the GMP area, right? To get comfortable, go through the aseptic gowning and sterile processing, to be able to make a product. And then the sheer manufacturing plant itself needs to be built around people, which takes more space than scaling with automation. So I do think that as we move toward more end-to-end solutions with automation, and we build out our supply chain networks, it will take a few years to get to the point that we need to supply where this may be going. It'll also be highly dependent upon the clinical outcomes of what is the demand versus the supply. But as you know, looking at the crystal ball and the technologies that are being worked on and the therapeutic areas that are being addressed, not just at J&J, but across the industry, these are big therapeutic areas. There are high unmet needs, and we need to gear up the engine to be able to meet that. And that's going to take a few years to get that set up.
Meg, have you got anything to add?
No, that was responded to beautifully by you two.
we've got time for one last question. It's been mentioned that J&J has invested significantly behind some of these new facilities. $1 billion been mentioned. What does it mean for those that don't necessarily have the funds to do that? And I guess just thinking about that, one thing I think it's worth reflecting on here: is there a role for CDMOs, perhaps that can democratize access to some of these facilities, or is this actually about that people don't necessarily need to, particularly biotechs, need to make this sort of automation investment if they're developing something that then ultimately can be manufactured on an automated platform? Is it for the J&Js and the likes of this world to become the leaders in that, have access to those, and the biotechs need to focus on creating something that's really efficacious, and then actually that investment the big farmers or maybe the CDMOs are making in manufacturing can be accessed later on? Interested in your thoughts on that, John. What if you're a biotech, and as Meg points out earlier, and you've got some of these funding constraints and you can't necessarily, and maybe shouldn't, because I think we know over the last few years a lot of biotechs did spend a lot of money on manufacturing that didn't necessarily prove to be some of the best investments. Interesting in thoughts, John. How does someone like J&J think about this, and is there a role to play in perhaps trying to make the industry more capital efficient?
Yeah, no, I think obviously autologous cell therapy to commercialize is a very expensive venture, right? As the technology continues to play out, I do think, and if we continue to see the driving force on the efficacy and the needs, I do think there's opportunities for CDMOs that allow that scalability, and automation allows that democratization of that technology to other areas so that it can be built out. My view on it is you need to think about the end game, obviously, but you also have to get the efficacy, the reason to believe, to invest, but also think about the process very early on so that if it does hit and it needs to scale, that you've already given some thought. It may not be full automation, but at least you've thought through the process enough to say that I can take it to a stage that we can get it launched, or these are the modifications we may need to do to the process so that we continue to have the efficacy, but yet we've thought ahead to the scalability of it.
And I guess I would just flag for I always think hopefully the last time, but unfortunately it still proves to be a bugbear, is closing of processes. I mean, I'm sure you still see it, there's still the number of processes that are out there that are not even fully closed, and again it's this tension between, I think, how we would like to think of us as a field and the maturity, and yet there are still some really important things that can happen. I think once we've got a closed process, certainly as Cellular Origins, we're pretty comfortable that it's automatable. We've created the foundation for doing that, but you need to close the process. Ideally, you need to think about lean processes. Let's not automate bad processes where there's inefficiencies in them. Meg, interested in you've got any thoughts around how we resolve that tension between the cost to kind of take these therapies to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of doses, and how biotech and perhaps others that are more capital constrained should address that?
Yeah, I mean, right now, given the historical points you're referencing, it's definitely not to build your own solution. It is to buy a solution, and I think there's so many great inexperienced CDMOs out there that, and they're all sort of very accustomed to the let's see, the prevailing winds of the cell therapy space, and so I do consider them an essential component in the ecosystem, especially for early stage biotechs. And even better, right, are CDMOs who are utilizing automation, right? Because I think that one lesson I've learned, and John, pluck your ears here, but one lesson I've learned is that for a pharmaceutical company to have interest in an acquisition, there has to be parity in the manufacturing processes, whether that be cell therapy or any other. There is greater resistance, I would say, or it makes it even more challenging to work with a strategic that has no familiarity with the manufacturing process of that product, right? That's an additional risk, we'll just put it that way, for any potential acquisition. So where there's similarities, it just eases the conversation and the opportunity. So again, as you're seeing great companies like J&J moving towards automation, that's a leading indicator that the rest of the field should be thinking about it as well, to create that parity and similarity within the manufacturing processes.
Thanks, Meg. Yeah, I think that's a nice point. I think to draw things all together is, at the end of the day, it does come down to these therapies. It comes down to that comparability as we move it through the process. I think that's what we all want, is the years of investment, the time and effort, and the biological skill that have gone into creating these incredibly efficacious therapies. That's what we all want to see come out the other end with the same level of efficacy that it started. I think that's been a challenge for the field, is automation's almost been seen as, I think, a divergent from that. It's changing the process. It's something you jump across to at some later stage. And I think that's perhaps the thing that we all need to really stay focused on, is let's make sure we end up, yes, we want to reduce costs. Yes, we want to reduce variability. Yes, we want to increase scale. But if we can't do that without keeping that same comparability, that same efficacy, then we're not going to succeed for the patients, which is what this all comes down to, is making sure at the end of the day we continue to create these incredibly efficacious therapies and we get them to scale. On that note, I want to thank Meg and John for your time today. You've been incredibly generous with your insights and knowledge. I really appreciate that, as I'm sure the audience do. And I want to say thank you